in the Poems of Ossian, there's this phrase that keeps coming up in many of the poems. It's the joy of grief. That there's a kind of a comfort in the melancholy.
Yeah.
And there's maybe, you could think about this two tracks. There's maybe one that, I mean, you don't want to just be in doom all the time and fall into depression, but, you know, there's a comfort that you can recognize we have to go through some kind of grief process. That's kind of the trade-off of existence. You know, we eat and we will be eaten. Our parents will die, you know, but hopefully life can go on, you know, and if we can give life, that's the kind of redeeming quality. And I think to speak to painting, there's a kind of a redemption quality to life, that you can make something that will outlive you.
I'd like to thank our top sponsors Bergamo, Matthias Proy, Sean Roberts, Viorel Trandafir, and Fergus Ryan for making this show possible, and welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Sometimes a man has to travel the whole world only to discover he should have stayed home, but then it would not have been his hero's journey. My guest is a Scottish kitsch painter seeking the mythic landscape. For what is Earth but an archive of human existence across hundreds of thousands of years? He is also concerned with archetypal poetry and the knowledge, even medicine, it may afford us. Alastair Blain, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you for having me.
First off, I'd like to ask you, is there anything here that you did not make? Because this is just fantastic. This is your landscape painting from where?
The Isle of Arran.
The Isle of
Arran.
Okay.
Arran.
Okay.
Arran.
Good. I'll take your word for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Glen Rosa. I've been there many times as a child, and they call it the Sleeping Warrior. The mountain, the ridgeline. Yeah.
Great. That's a mythic
It's a
dimension
mythic.
already.
Yeah, indeed.
Uh-huh.
So,
yeah, we'll get into it. I think we should talk more about that, but I was just, you know, when I always prepare for the conversation, and I think, what should we start with? And then I sit down here today and I look at the wall, I look at the shelf, all the things that you've done here, and I'm thinking, okay, this is something we need to devote some time to. But obligatory first, bio, like how did you try to educate yourself within painting? And I say try because this is a story we've sort of also heard before, but I think it's important to hear it. Yeah,
well, without maybe repeating other people's stories, it's you go through school and no one really teaches you much practical knowledge, but you have this desire to figure more. Started in my hometown, Paisley. There was a basic, chalk and charcoal and making sketches, how to use tone and things. So I had this tendency, but life took me to New Zealand. I met a girl at the time, and there was not much for me in Scotland, or so I thought. And I pursued it. My father said, "Son, on you go." So it was remarkable to have his blessing at 16, 17.
Wow.
And within the first year I got into visual arts, very modern. I wanted to paint, but it was everything but painting.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this photography, textiles.
But this was an art school, or was it? No, this was visual
Yeah, the course was visual arts, but it was like a tech, it's like a college, general higher education. But soon after that year, this girl fell apart, and my relationship with the school fell apart. So, and I heard about this other school called Hungry Creek Art and Craft School. And it's in the middle of the bush. So I thought this was very attractive. There was ceramics and in the nature. So I lived in a tent for most of this year, gradually upgrading to a studio building where I'd sleep on a couch and kind of rediscover something of the man in nature, the wild man. And this this foliage started to grow on my face.
For some strange reason.
Yeah. But after that year, that was the last year that school was alive. It fell apart, it moved to the city.
But did you learn anything there that you wanted to learn?
It was pretty independent. No, I didn't. It was acrylic, making a mess on acrylic, but there were some nice things with ceramics with clay.
Yeah, so you learned some things despite of the school.
Yeah. Very nice people, like the students. I learned a lot more from the students than I did maybe the teachers.
Right.
And then I moved down to another school, which was more like a blend of the two. It was in the city, but it also had this maybe more natural craft element. And that's where I discovered oil paint, which was such a revelation, the quality of oil paint. And of course, then it was very synthetic colours, and I'd not heard about the Apelles palette. No one had showed me this yet, so still striving to do something. But that year ended and my visa ran out. But there's a love story here as well. So
please tell.
Well, her name is Rosalie. Oh, she's so fair. And she went to the same art school, and so we become acquainted. But after that year, I was taken away, visa and whatnot. So her plan was to follow later, some months. But it happened that she got sick, and it was 2 years before she could come. And in that time, I heard about another school in Vienna, the VAVA, the Academy of Visionary Art.
Holy.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened there?
Well, it's kind of a brainchild of Ernst Fuchs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and so it was...
When did you go there? What year?
2017.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it's an interesting place because they had a rotation of tutors coming around, and these were artists that, it's kind of a master apprentice model. But with that breadth of different people, you discover maybe, what doesn't work for you, and you find maybe what does work for you. So.
And these were people concerned with craft, but actually painting, representational or figurative?
Yeah, it's more big spectrum. So visionary art, it kind of comes out of maybe more psychedelia.
Okay.
Yeah. You have like Alex Gray, who's this kind of X-ray vision, and he depicts bodies, but in this very kind of anatomic way. Concerned with the divinity and spiritual visions, and very interested in the Eastern Buddhist tanka paintings and these sorts of things. So, but I was always concerned more with more European spiritual, tendencies. That was my temperament. So yeah, I had a year, just over a year there, and I met one artist, Daniel Morante, who share still to this day, a very good friendship, and he made brown paintings, which I was very, very taken by, because it's the earth pigments. And,
right. Yeah.
and he had a lot of practical old master knowledge that was very, quite clear, and yeah.
Was there at any point any question of any awareness of the mythical perspective or the archetypal perspective there? Or?
Yeah, there was definitely hints, and there was a big part of the focus.
But you were all the time doing landscape painting, or?
Yeah, it would. There would maybe be a theme for each trimester, so I'd always kind of directed in some kind of a landscape way.
Right. Okay. So you would go outside in the suburbs, or
not
surroundings,
really.
or?
Not really at that time. I never discovered plein air until maybe after I returned. I found Oleg Korolev, 'cause this was after Daniel Morante.
Russian painter.
And I discovered that the Russians really kept their tradition of painting. They didn't quite fall into the same maybe modernist traps. So I learned.
He taught at that school, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was 5 weeks. So he would just point to the masters. He would point to the museum, the Kunsthistorische, and we would go to see Rembrandt and Titian and Caravaggio, and we'd make these videos and scanning to then look back and study and compare. So very strong character, very quite disciplined, and it was something I was yearning for.
Because it seems like he had a quite decisive influence on you in that sense when it came to what you should study and be influenced by.
Yeah, absolutely, and this need for like imperative study.
Yeah.
It's all very well to be in the flow and be very nice, but if you really want to make a masterpiece, I mean, it's hard work.
Yeah.
And you need to use a lot of paint. I remember he came to one of the students and he looked at the palette and he said, "What is this? It looks like a mouse." Mouse poo. You need to use paint, don't be afraid of paint. And so I was just, very much lapping this up. But he would also have this interesting way to receive, a vision. Or what should you paint, and to really meditate and sit down and be calm and still and be receptive to, you have a question about a certain theme or a certain subject, and you kind of get the mind away, quieten the mind, and so that was useful to maybe be a bit clear about what I'm going to begin with.
So is that, because I think that is a fundamental thing. I mean, equally as much as learning the actual craft, to be aware of what you are going to paint and why you're doing it, which direction are you going. So you're not just painting pictures. But it seems like what you're describing there, with what Oleg Korolev was talking about, as I understand you, is that, that is that awareness. And maybe this is me reading it into it, but it seems like that it's a natural consequence then that steers you to a more timeless conception of what is important. Am I understanding it correctly? Yeah. And how does that relate to? I mean, we shouldn't forget the landscape there. So is this typical of the way of painting that you learned in Vienna, or is this something that has sort of emerged?
I think it's progressed.
Yeah.
It's progressed. I think when I was first learning with Oleg, there was tendency to use the brush strokes and to gather, you know, this thick ground. But a lot of it is me, you know, since coming home to Scotland and seeing really what I have here in the landscape. And there's this kind of devotion. Keep going out, observe, I will make studies, you know.
Because it seems, just noticed one thing, it seems as if you are, I'm quite concerned with that. I mean, when you paint something, you don't just, well, of course you do that, but don't just copy the color and the form. But if you can recreate matter as well, then it starts to become like next level. And if you can add some mythical content, then you're pretty much there.
You get this liveliness, this vibrancy, and I think that can come when you maybe have this contact with nature and you really, absorb it.
Yeah,
it's inside, and you can be in the studio. You can be comfortable. And you take your time and just build the layers and the black, glazing and the black, sandwiching the black between the grey.
Yeah.
So I can't say I learned this from, you know, someone in particular. It's a whole journey.
Right. Yeah. But that experience with Korolev in Vienna was quite important.
It was quite a game changer.
Because no one had really in that way steered you towards the old masters.
No.
As he did.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm thinking about also the so-called sketches by John Constable, where he really does that. He sort of paints with earth, with dirt. You know, it's just glides together. And of course, that's what you're doing when you're doing oil paint, right?
Yeah.
But can you speak a little bit to this idea of how do you create a mythic landscape? Like you know, and you talked about when we've been preparing for this conversation being claimed by a specific spot in the landscape and what that does, and or what that is. And that can easily seem quite vague. Can you sort of specify a bit more exactly? Of course, there's a limit to how much you can be concrete here. But
it's difficult to pinpoint, but there will be a point. Maybe you're going on a walk, you're wandering in the landscape, and in my experience, there'll be a place, or maybe a few points along your place where you have to stop, and you just have to breathe and observe, and to be, I mean, the wonder of nature, to be, you know, bathed in this, and maybe it's a certain alignment of a tree or a rock, and the way that, you know, frames your view, and, you know, nature can compose, and use this perspective observer wandering through. So, you know, you take note, or maybe bring the sketchbook,
which you've also made yourself.
Yeah.
That is a nice one. Where's that?
Well, it doesn't exactly exist, because this is the kind of composition element that you maybe go for a walk and you see this mountain, but then you see that mountain, and you could bring them together.
That's where you're juggling quite a few.
Yeah. So there is a waterfall near where I live. So this river is called the Black Water, and it's very good to dig into the names of places. Then there'll be some mythic quality, perhaps, or poetic quality at the least. And this flows into the green water, and it becomes the River Gryffe, and that means grief. It's an old word for grief. So there's something poetic about that. I'm very working with that a lot. The River of Grief.
Wow.
So
that gives me goosebumps. That's great. And that sort of touches upon one thing that I'm concerned with that you know, it's, I think, a fault people can make. It can be understood two ways, what you're saying now. So one, like if you go in the wrong direction, the wrong path, you can think that because you know something about it, then the painting is good because you have a story in your head. But on the other side, as I think you're describing, is you discover these things and you see them as sort of mythical images, and that arouses your attention and you really focus much on it, but then blend that with the study of actual nature, right? So it's not just I felt this, therefore the painting is good, right? Yeah. Okay. So you basically created that drawing. I mean, you didn't copy what you saw.
You can't go and take a photo of this. No.
You know, that's you are aware of Lars Hartwig, I believe.
Yeah.
And I've talked about that because that was such a revelation to me when we actually traveled to see Bork Island, me and when we were doing the hunt about Nerdrum, and to see that island has like a whole mass on the side of it, like an equally large part of the mountain is on the side. It's actually on the side here. So he has just taken that off and made that sort of ship turning as it comes around the corner there. Yeah. But if you do that, you really need to. You must not think naturalistically.
Yeah. You understand. How nature composes. You know, and make it plausible.
But then you go out, and you do individual sketches as well of that specific place, right? Yeah. So you mix that in your studio when you get home. But you do oil sketches as well out there?
Yeah. I have this box, this kit, which, well, actually, no. This is from memory.
This here.
This painting here, yeah.
Can I?
Maybe it's a bit dark. Yeah.
Okay. This here.
Yeah. So I made a pencil drawing on a piece of paper just to get the shape and to try and just have this contact. And that was made in the studio.
And that's there are quite a few things to talk about here then, because this is Western Scotland, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you had said that you had traveled to Iceland, I would have said, okay, where is it? Where in Iceland is it? I mean, that part of Scotland I've never been, and I should go. That seems to be really primal.
Yeah.
And I think that's a major issue here.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting piece of Scotland because it's not maybe quite what you're imagining with these the Highlands. I call it the Highlands of the Lowlands. There's this, they're not quite mountains, but they're high hills, and a very rugged beauty to them. It's moorlands and bogs and heather. But as you come down the valley, it's very cultivated. So it's years and years of farming, and there's Iron Age hill forts and things that long forgotten trees everywhere. So it's underneath there's this primal quality, and that's what I'm seeking to find everywhere, and to bring that out.
Because you talked about that there's a history back, at least as we know, to like Neolithic at least.
Yeah. And
what does that do to your perception of the landscape?
It's expansive, It's a wild way to go, and I think it cures a lot of this modern isolation. These brick houses and people living on the landscape, making things that they need. It's endless. It's endless for me.
And it in my mind, it sort of plays also into what you've been talking about, how a lot of your friends are craftspeople. Because you said something, what did you say? How the eternal human feeds all this craft, something like that. When we did some of our preparatory conversations.
Yeah.
And that really struck me. That there's, I think when you do that, you make these books, and you make your own brushes.
Yeah.
You're doing a video on that.
Indeed.
I'm looking forward to learning how to make brushes.
Yeah.
And how that, I mean, I think what is the specific time you're living in starts disappearing when you're working with something that is so concrete.
Yeah.
Because this is something you can make at any point in time, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about it, it's almost like food, you know, we want to eat organic, homegrown, you know, healthy food. And I think the materials that we work with, can ode to that. You know, we do well to at least think about, you know, where do our brushes come from? Where does our oil paint come from?
Yeah, and that's, speaking of which, oil paint, this is what? So
this is a red sand from La Veiviseren. There's an old tradition that the red is it's the blood of giants.
Yes.
Yeah. So we can talk about maybe making a video of how to grind some pigment.
That'd be awesome. Because have you done it now earlier to make your own paint?
Yeah.
From the ground.
Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's very good to use in the ground of the painting.
Yeah.
You have this.
So you have your painting earth on earth.
Yeah. But it's you need quantities, you know, and certain you're limited, of course, with certain pigments. You can't maybe find everything that you need. So it's like a supplement, like a health supplement, you know.
But how do you find when you go out? You study nature. You make these sketches, and you come back to the studio. How is that working in the studio? How do you keep that mood or that light that you saw?
Yeah, I mean, so you have to have the memory. I think training your memory, and I mean, of late, I think I've done so much sketches on the landscape, and I keep going back to the same places so that, that's fresh. And if I find that I'm struggling, you need to go out. You know, it's not be too stuck. Don't be too domestic.
Because I remember reading about, I think that was in the memoirs of John Constable, where he talks about painting inside in the winter, spending the summertime to do sketches as much as he could, and then having the material for the winter, and then making his exhibition paintings then. But in the beginning, I noticed he was talking about that a problem for him was that the colors became too cool. So is there anything particular like that you've experienced painting inside? Because you're obviously not standing in front of the motif then.
Well, if it's too cool, then you make it warmer. Yep. It's quite simple. Yeah. But I think it needs time to sit, to dry, to come back in maybe some months, some weeks with fresh eyes, and it needs this. And
But do you, I mean, like if you paint the sky here, you do just from memory, or can you look out your window and see a similar sky that you start mixing into it?
Yeah, I could, but I think with the kind of training of observing and working with the nature, it's in you, so you know how to mix. You know, I don't try to be too literal. You think I want to copy this cloud, and you can get caught up in this kind of rendering mentality. And I try and think about the general, like what's the theme, like what's the mood, and when you're concerned with like this kind of twilight just after dusk, there's a principle that it's cooler and it goes warmer. So you can just work with that, and it's a very sound approach, I feel. And with the Apelles palette, this 4 colours, it's very, very simple.
It limits you, but it's, as Christine Onskude said, it's also the unlimited palette.
Yeah. And the blue, it's so blue.
Yeah. That's what you've used white black here.
This is the first painting where I think I undertook the Apelles palette in pure form, and I was absolutely, my jaw was on the floor.
Yeah.
You know.
I've experienced using it and thinking this is too blue. I need to tone it down. Yeah. But that's also a sort of a mythical dimension of the palette itself. Mm-hmm. This thing how all the colors are used in all the parts of the painting, so that literally you're telling yourself that everything reflects everything else. Yeah. When you've been talking about that, I was thinking about there's a Norwegian movie called The Pathfinder. It's about the Sami people, and they have a shaman, and so the main character, his family is killed by the Chudas. They are forgotten that they belong to nature, and he says, "Don't forget it. Don't forget you too. Filled with revenge." And then he asks the young man, "Can you see what is between you and the tent, the inside of the tent?" "No, I can't see anything." And then there's a quite dramatic scene where he suddenly takes his hand over his mouth and nose, and he can't breathe. It's like, now you can see it. There's something that you belong to, that you need in order to survive. Yeah. And that's the kind of the feeling I get when you're talking about your relation to the landscape, the mythic relation to the landscape. Yeah. But speaking of, you've talked about the poems of Ossian and similar stories. I want to hear, if I've understood you correctly, that has also influenced you in the way you paint the landscape, or how does that play in? What are they, and what have you have you learned from that?
The Poems of Ossian,
for example.
Yeah. Well, I think within it's this, ancient poetry, and it has a very you can see when you read and experience these poems. Well, they're from the oral tradition, so they should be spoken or sung, but they really are of the landscape.
Can I just pause you for a little second? So basically, you should literally read them out loud when you're to really get it most out of it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of description of and simile between the landscape and the characters, and not to excess. It's for a reason. There's specific effects that they're getting at. So that helps just to I think clarify the focus of certain things.
But is that, I find when you really read good literature and you have these passages of description that are not specifically related to the story, specifically describing some type of action, but the descriptions of, for example, the landscape or the surrounding would be such that you understand that this is a metaphor for what is going on.
Absolutely.
In the story, right?
Yeah.
Is there something to that in the Ossian? Because I've read, you sent me the one that is called Carthon.
Carthon, yeah.
Carthon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You want to say something about that, so to sort of get the feel of it?
Yeah, certainly. So that opens, if you remember, there's a description of these 3 pine trees on a mound. And the deer of the hill are afraid they don't go there because of the ghost that haunts this place. And it's important. The arc of that story, it's about a father, a mother and a child. and this grief of loss, because the father Clessimore, he's washed up on the shore of a town near where I live, actually. It doesn't exist anymore because it was burned down, and he flees. He has an affair with this Moina, and so she has a child, but he's never met his father. So he comes of age, and the kinsmen of the father have burned down the town, so it's a revenge story. So these three, and everyone dies, of course. The father and the son do battle.
Not knowing
until the end, until it's too late, and they're both bleeding, and it's this tragedy. So these three trees in the beginning, you don't realize till the end that it's this mirror, you know.
Yes. So the landscape is a mirror, a symbol for what is going on in the story. And I think is that because when take your painting here, so there's no specific story here. No, there's no two clear figures doing anything. But how do you try to create a story then when there's no acting protagonists, or are we talking about a mood, or what's the sort of direction that you're taking with it?
There's an element to the mood. I think for me, the story will emerge, and I would like to go more in this maybe more direct depiction of a story, of a narrative. But it's kind of the mythic quality to your own life. As me being the character, and I go here, and I've gone here since I was a child, so it's very important to me. It's affected me for a long time. This giant warrior sleeping there. So yeah, it's more of a mood, and it's more of a place that one can wander and have a bit of peace from the modern existence with bills to pay.
Yeah, I think that's fundamental, and especially in our time. And I'm thinking about it because I should mention, we are really in debt to you, because you suggested that we should start with the critique nights where people can send in work, and Sebastian Salvo and myself, in all humbleness, try to give you some advice. This is where you say that I'm really good at giving advice and stuff like that. So,
yeah, you're fine. You do a fine job.
Thank you.
But I'm in debt to you.
Yeah, but when you started posting your landscapes there, and I was thinking about it because I was immediately struck by it, that, and Sebastian and I have been talking about it too, where you depict a landscape where this is where I want to be. And it has something to do with, like, for example, I've been looking a little bit at this. There's all kinds of these bushcraft videos, on YouTube, and they're not saying anything. They're just making fire, sitting there eating, putting up their, cutting some wood and making their house. Yeah. And then you think that there's something to that.
Yeah. I will survive.
Yeah. And that you know that you can survive in such a situation, and that there's no letters coming, no emails to read, nothing like that.
That's the timeless human position. And we do well to remember that.
Yeah. So you want to go more in a direction where you include figures in your landscapes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can't you see?
Yes, I noticed that straight away.
Yeah, of course, of course. No, I think it's a conversation between humanity and the landscape. So, you know, I've been concerned with this primal landscape with no human contact. But I think that's not enough to maybe relate, you know, to leave humanity out. I think a lot of this conservation activism, it says, like, let's make a wall around the wild and leave the wild alone.
Yeah, as if we weren't nature. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. But it's a relationship to nature, and we can learn the ways of nature, and we can, you know, improve and care for it.
I'm thinking all the time of Joseph Campbell when he talks about how we have the earth in us. We are a part of it. We have water in us, and all these things, you know. And you know, when Joseph Campbell says it, it's quite grand, you know, the way he says it, and you know he can say it. And he talks about how these are the eyes of the earth, and these are the ears of the earth.
Yeah. Well, then you get to this indigenous perspective here, you know, where, for thousands of years, you know, these cultures, wherever, all over the world, were living in a very similar way, different particulars, different practices, but the same understanding that, you know, we don't own the land owns us, and we're just here to care, and it's steward, guardianship, if you will.
Yeah.
But it's very hard in this modern time to embody that role in its fullness, you know.
Yeah, there's something about, it's on a slight side note, but I think it plays into what you're saying. Knowing, well, when you read myths and you start to recognize, you know, political movements or whatever is going on in your time as mythical characters, as that part of the story where things are rough, and it will end like that, or, well, of course you have to act, you have to not just wait until it happens, but there's something about keeping your mental sanity when you think mythically, because you don't get confused by fashion, you don't get like in that scene by Mel Gibson, and this is so embarrassing, but I always mix up the Mayas, Incas, and whatever because I haven't studied it.
Sure.
But they sacrificed these human beings on top of that pyramid, and then the moon comes, or there's a what do you call it, eclipse.
Yeah.
So they have to stop. But then when they go back to the place where they were kept captive, they run on each side and they are hitting and making a lot of noise, so they can't think and can't see, and they can't you know, try to plan how to escape. And I think that's the contemporary time. And the myths are where you sort of go into that collective unconscious that Jung is talking about, and you see that you hear all that noise on the outside of the walls, but you know that there's a tunnel here going under here and coming up there and connecting you with the grand perspective there.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of noise, you know, and to calm and get clear what's really important, you know.
Are there other stories that have influenced you, or painters? I mean, we haven't really talked about that. Specific landscape painters that you've been studying, and what you've learned from them.
Yeah, well, I learned a lot from, there's a Scottish landscape painter, Horatio McCulloch, who that's really when I learned about him and his approach. That's when I really started to get out into the landscape, make the sketches, and he would, you know, a month trip round the Highlands, and he would come back to Glasgow and make these big versions, these big compositions, kind of 19th century romantic landscapes. And they're always the ones that I stop at in the museum. There's something about it.
And what, like, specifically, what does he do? Like, what is his direction.
Yeah, it's this thick strokes. You know, very. There's a sketchy quality, but there's a fineness as well. There's a fine. You know, it's this balance. And yeah, his use of glazing, say in the foreground, is kind of a reddish dark over this thick texture. Maybe it's foliage. Yeah, so I learned a lot from him, and I heard, you know, he would use a goose feather sometimes to make this kind of tree foliage shapes, which is quite, you know.
Yeah. You use whatever gives you that effect that you need.
Yeah. Absolutely. And towards the end of his life, you know, he could recreate from his hands, from his practice, from his mind, very plausible romantic paintings. You know, you can't go there.
Yeah. Well, it reminds a little bit about, wasn't it Degas who had that idea of a school where you had 3 floors or whatever, and in the first floor you stood in front of the model to draw or paint. In the second year you painted in the second floor and you went down to look at the model and up again, and then the third floor, and you went down and then up again. So that you memorize what you see so that you can study it. And I think that's I haven't done a survey, but I imagine that is a topic that is quite important to clarify for, you know, generally if you're a representational painter today, that if it should be completely true to what you see, or how much you can remember and paint on your own, because it's easy to think, okay, I'll be totally exact, and then it can very easily become boring.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. You need to take it a step further.
I want to come back to Ossian. I've learned from you, you're supposed to say Ossian.
Ossian, yeah.
And these images that you've seen there, that you see in the text. And then when you go out and you're claimed by the landscape, as you say, some specific spot, can you talk a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, it's a mystery. It's part of this spirit of the earth, language of the earth, where you can recognize something. It's hard to say exactly what it is, but I think there's a certain thread that you can follow. It's like you just have a little taste, you know, and it might be a sunset, particular times of the day or the night as well. It's a contact.
So it's not something, I mean, and I understand it's kind of in some way a bit stupid to ask a question like that, because you can't totally like empirically explain it, but then when you're concerned with that archetypal perspective, I guess that's when you, well, speaking of what you talked about when it comes to Oleg Korolev, and as I understood you to be receptive to what things that strike you. Why do they strike you, and let them strike you, I guess.
Yeah.
And that reading myths or similar things is a way of doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's why I say there's a kind of a medicine in it, because, you know, we can learn something about human nature, the archetypal perspective, and maybe why things are like. I often look, there's in a lot of Scotland, there's these mounds, you know, these very particular mounds, and I just wonder, you know, there's no archaeological digs, you can't dig every hill, but I wonder what's under there.
Yeah,
it could be, you know.
So that's that desire, that desire
Mm.
that gives you the makes you commit to that motif and stick with it and not just give up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And learning the history of a particular place, you start to gather a kind of a picture and maybe build a map of over time.
Yeah.
Of who was here. You know, and one thing I'm really concerned with at the moment is, why is this river called the River of Gryffe? You know, it's a Gryffe, which is an old Brythonic word, like it's not Gaelic, it's an older language that the people they're no more. And it's around the Roman time. So one can infer the River of Gryffe must have been a battle, you know, something to do with the Romans. But again, it's like a lost tale. There's no archaeological.
Well, it's kind of like you give things importance because you focus on them. And that's, so to put it negatively, that's the problem with like outright naturalism and photorealism, that everything is important because everything is treated with, it's like a democratic approach to it, right?
Yeah.
But what you're talking about is that sentimentality towards it and lust for it. And I think that's, you don't have to say much more about it or write an analysis of what the story is, but when that need is there, then that, you know, you feel that somehow.
Yeah.
You know, that's like where it becomes difficult to say exactly what it is.
Yeah. And you know, there's, in the Poems of Ossian, there's this phrase that keeps coming up in many of the poems. It's the joy of grief. That there's a kind of a comfort in the melancholy.
Yeah.
And there's maybe, you could think about there's two tracks. There's maybe one that, I mean, you don't want to just be in doom all the time and fall into depression, but, you know, there's a comfort that you can recognize we have to go through some kind of grief process. That's kind of the trade-off of existence. You know, we eat and we will be eaten. Our parents will die, you know, but hopefully life can go on, you know, and if we can give life, that's the kind of redeeming quality. And I think to speak to painting, there's a kind of a redemption quality to life, that you can make something that will outlive you. But I've been thinking about this a lot, the joy of grief, and you know, why do we listen to melancholic music? Why do we enjoy that? This pathos, you'd say.
And why do you think?
Yeah, well, we realise we're not alone. Our situation, might have particular reasons in this time, but it's an eternal human condition to have loss, to have love and have loss, and but also remember that it continues. I think any great story will give you that.
Yeah, I've thought about that when it comes to The Sick Child by Edvard Munch. That you don't necessarily need to have lost your sister in tuberculosis or have anyone die, literally, but there can be a sense of loss somehow, in some way. And when you look at that, then you, I guess, get confirmed somehow. So it doesn't solve, here's a quick fix for your sorrow, but it confirms that that's something that is valid, or I don't know what word to use. There's a comfort there. And I guess it's the same thing. I've been listening to this podcast, The Integrated Human, and it talks about when, being there with someone who's dying, then you don't try to, here's the solution for you, because there is no solution.
Yeah.
You just try to be present.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's what you're describing here.
Yeah. yeah, it's a care, you know. It's a look in the eye. It's a hand, you know, with grace and yeah, recognise.
So we have to think about how we construct this plot. Now we've been really calm, so we need something light.
Some lively.
Something on a lighter note. You want to say something more about the things you have on the shelf here?
Yeah, well, from the brushes, I've had this...
Just hold it up to, see if I can hold it up to the face so you can...
this, the quest to make a brush.
Yeah.
Because they can be so expensive. And while I was in Vienna, I picked up a wild boar pelt, this skin, at one of these like reenactment medieval festival. You know, they have the pelt man.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I sat for some years, and I don't really know what drove me to first experiment with it, but yeah, it unfolded and tried to...
Did you discover it yourself? I mean, did you develop it yourself? Did you learn?
Yeah, this method, yeah. So, well, we can do the demonstration, or I can show you in detail. But it's very simple. I'm using beeswax. And I think this is a hemp thread, but I also use linen from the canvas. When I cut the canvas, there's these strings.
Yeah.
So braid them together and you have this, you know. You can use, and I mean, you can be particular if you like. This one's a badger.
Right.
A badger fur, which is slightly softer.
So which hairs are the best? Or very different uses?
There's different qualities. I mean, the boar is the best. It's the strongest, it can hold the most paint. You can also get fine hair depending on where you use, from which part of the beast. So this is a good kind of scumbling, scrubbing brush, whereas others are a bit more direct, painterly strokes. Yeah, you can make big, small, whatever your need demands.
They're so much more organic.
Yeah, it's like food.
Yeah, think about, you know, a straight brush, that's an abomination actually.
Yeah.
When you hold this.
Yeah. And, you know, I showed these brushes to Odd.
Yeah.
Being here is such a gift. And, oh, this is so wonderful.
Yeah.
It's like a Rembrandt brush. Yes. Or even better, a Neanderthal.
Yes.
It should be in a Neanderthal museum. I like that. That quality. I think about the cave painters, you know, a lot, and so it. What did they use, you know?
What is this thing here?
This, you'll appreciate that. You can pull it out. So these are my watercolor set.
Your watercolor set.
So these are my brushes. Yeah.
These are brushes.
Yeah, for watercolor. Yeah, it's easy in the pocket, you know. And these are an old recipe. I didn't make these, but it's a good paint company in the north of England.
I'll try to hold it up.
These little cakes. Yeah. Yeah.
Jesus.
And you know, it's a recipe with honey and I think some resin.
I should really visit you in Scotland. Jesus. Yeah. You make this also?
Yeah.
And what is it made of?
It's like a rawhide. So it's a deer skin that's not been tanned, it's not been softened, it's just been scraped like what you would use for an old drum. Yeah. For instance, yeah. Make a little box. And
God, we need to make a bushcraft series.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Okay, so what else do you have of nice things here?
Yeah, so my friends as well, Hamish, he's of Pictavia Leather mention, and he made a brush roll, or he made a tool roll for a carpenter, and I saw it and said, "Oh, I need one for my brushes." He's a fine craftsman. And these traditional Pictish Scottish symbols, the spirals, and he made a boar on one side, and it's just the handmade life,
Yeah. I really want to get into that. So I'm eager to learn from you on making brushes and different things. I mean, but just on a very very simple level, I just bought, because I think it's a related sensation. I bought this Bible from 1911, so it's in Fraktur in Gothic writing, and it's a completely different experience. I mean, you can find a Bible online, or you can print it out, or you can have whatever, something from 1990 or whatever. But then suddenly you're reading it, and you're reading images as well. Yeah. And that sensation there is, and you can say, well, that's just superficial makeup, whatever. It's not the truth, whatever, but it does matter.
It does. Aesthetic matters. Yeah. And I had the same experience with these are my books of Ossian. Oh. And these are wonderful. They don't make books like this anymore.
Yeah, hold on. Oh, yeah.
1800.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Oh my God.
And you have this illustrations in the first. And it's an entirely different experience.
Yeah.
You read the PDF.
Guilty.
Hey, but there's sure there's a convenience to that, but there's and these were down in England, and I ordered them to bring them back home.
Hey, can you, because maybe you should say a little thing about James MacPherson.
Yeah. So he was born native speaker of Gaelic in the Highlands, and I'm not sure what he was studying in Edinburgh, but he was at university, and he had this desire to record the oral tradition, record the tales of old, and translate them from Gaelic, or from Urs at that point, which
Urs.
is Urs, which is interesting. The Germanic Ur prefix is ancient, right?
Okay, yeah.
So it's this, an old form of Gaelic. He went around the Highlands and Islands, recording these stories from storytellers around the fire. I don't know, but and he brought them back to town, and the first edition heavily scrutinized. So where is the manuscript? Are these fabrications? And he was, not widely accepted at the time in the literature world. But somehow they got across to Europe, and it was 1760s, I think, they came out, and it spread like wildfire all around, especially Eastern Europe, Czech Republic. You have this almost fanatic obsession with these poems, and you have these big, quite large classical paintings depicting Ossian and the ghosts and all of this in Czech Republic, would you believe?
It sounds strange, but I mean, that just speaks to the universality of it.
Exactly. And I heard that the Grimm's brothers, they read this and were inspired to undertake their version of recording these old stories and bringing them out into text. And I think the Kalevala, the Finnish.
With the Lönnrot,
I think this is also responsible for James MacPherson. So It's very popular. I heard it's the most popular form of media ever in world history. But many people, even in Scotland, don't know about it. It's
yeah, and you said you didn't learn about
No.
them in school.
no. I was lucky to maybe get a bit of the Greek, but still very basic. Not even a sketch of this. So it was years of yearning for some kind of contact with the old traditions of Scotland. I know I looked at the Norse, the Germanic. I looked at the Irish, and there's a kinship with the Irish tradition, because you have Ossian, his father Fingal. In Scotland we call him, but in Ireland we call him Finn MacCool.
Yeah.
But there's a different temperament to the
Is that the story of? I'm thinking of getting back to that point of what this mindset how it can help you, especially in our times, which, let's say, disregards it. But is that the story with Finn MacCool? Is that the man who goes away he thinks he's away for 3 years, comes back, it's 300 years?
Yeah.
And he's allowed to go back to visit his family, and he must not touch the ground.
This is it. Yeah.
And when he does, he immediately turns to ashes.
Yeah.
And I've thought a lot about that when he comes back to society and accepts society, touches the time, his own time, then him as a eternal being dies. And that's what you need to be aware of. So that doesn't happen to you, right? You bring the gold back, and then it just is ashes.
Certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, you can bring the gold back, but who is really going to understand?
Oh, here's someone talking about eternity and the joy of grief. Come on, tell us. Right?
Are they going to catch this gold?
Probably not going to happen, yeah. So what is your take on that? Or how do you take care of that? It's like, any quick fix advice about
oh dear,
not to be eternal.
No, there's no quick fix. But I think just keep your nearest and dearest very close. You know, you don't need to have a lot of friends. You can use certain aspects of modernity. It's quite hard to live without it. You know, I could build a mud house in the woods, but you know, keeping that care, I think, keeping the something of the heart, the compassion, the sincerity, I think it's about keeping that alive, and realizing that things are going to change. It's always changing, you know. That reminds me, there's an old story in other Scottish folk tradition. This book was given to me by my grandfather.
That book?
Yeah, this very book. And it's signed, lovely, by the author, 1955. Best wishes, George Ian Smith. On Hogmanay, which is what we call New Year in Scotland. They're very short stories, but one of them has a similar motif of going to the land of Faerie. This is the Ossian story. He goes to Tir na Nog, which is the island of eternal youth, right? That's how he lives for 300 years. But in one of the stories here, it's a cave. He's a piper, and he's a young boy, and he's out pulling the bracken on a summer's day, and he's tired, so he says, I'll work harder when I have a wee sleep. I'll have a wee sleep. And he's a piper, he plays the bagpipes, and he has these sitting next to him. But in his sleep he has a dream, and he hears this bird whistling this tune, and he wakes up and he says, I must play this tune. I'll work even harder once I just remember this tune. And so he plays it, and the hill before him opens up, this cave, and you know, what boy could resist a cave? And he goes in, and of course the door closes, and he's in the darkness, the kind of darkness your eyes never get used to. And he starts to hear little feet pattering in the gloom, and then all of a sudden they bring torches and they say, ah. And in the story his name is Alastair. This is quite shocking. Alastair, you're long in coming. We've been expecting you, but you're welcome. Come through, and they come to a big hall underground, and there's the fairy queen herself. Ah, it's love. And she says to him, Alastair, come. You're from a famous family of pipers. Play us a tune. And they dance. The fairy people. They dance and dance and dance, and until his hands get a bit sore. He's tired. He keeps playing until eventually he can't play anymore. He says, "Oh, fairy queen, I'm finished," and he collapses asleep. When he wakes up, he's back on the hill. Everything quite normal. Oh, it's just a dream. So he goes back home, and he sees a wall where there wasn't a wall before. A tree where there was just a wee sapling. And he sees an old woman bent over the well. And he goes up to her and he says, "What? Who are you? Like this is my home." And she looks at him, and there's a kind of recognition. And, Alastair? Mother? And who is this stranger with a beard on his face? But he tells her the story, and she has a lot of joy. She understands. And sure, he lives a grand old age, but he never played that tune again that he heard in his dream. It's a lovely wee story. It speaks to this. You can go into the cave and have your time there and discover what you might discover. This golden lass, this light. But when you return, things will be different, Time passes, and you can't hold on to the constancy of everything, So there's a joy of grief in that, I think.
Wow. Unfortunately, I have to say something at the end. This should really have been just the last words, because this has been amazing. So, Alastair, thank you for coming to the cave. It's been a real joy.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd like to thank our other top sponsors, Dean Anthony, Jon Harald Aspheim, Alastair Blain, Anders Berge Christensen, Eric Lasky, Fernando Ramirez, Herman Borge, Hårek Jordal Andreasen, Iver Ykkestad, Jack Ens Warner, Jared Fountain, Jose Luis, Marion Bu Pedersen, Maurice Robbins, Michael Irish, Stacey Evangelista, Tone-Lise Rygås, Trim Jordal, William S. Ian, Yngve Helland for making the show possible. And I'll see you next month. But don't forget caveofapelles.com/subscribe. Become a member today.